Thank you for coming to today's presentation on rhetoric and how it can be integrated in ministry today. Rhetoric was originally written about by Aristotle, who was a student of Plato a long time ago. So let's look and see what rhetoric is. Rhetoric is simply all possible means of persuasion. Rhetoric, in a practical sense, is the art of discovering ways to convince an audience that an idea or a truth that they aren't fully convinced to be true. And so we see this a lot today in politics and in a lot of social media or just general media figures who would like to get a message across. So there are two means in which people can be persuaded, and these means of rhetoric are inartistic proofs and artistic proofs. Inartistic proofs are things that are outside of the control of the speaker or the presenter, such as testimony of witnesses, documentation, or statistics. These are going to be hardline proofs or more objective things to look at whenever you're looking at what you're being convinced of. Now, the artistic proofs are what we're going to put most of our focus on, because these are things that are inside of the control of the speaker. These are points of persuasion that the speaker can create. And these three categories are broken down into logos, pathos, and ethnos. Now, logos is the appeal to the listener's rationality. So this is formed from lines of arguments in speech. It isn't necessarily ironclad logic. It just needs to be reasonable to the audience. So these are going to be the argumentation side of things. This is going to be where the speaker is rationalizing why he believes what he believes to be true. And this tends to be a pretty effective way to convince someone of something. Pathos is the feeling that the listener gets from hearing the speech. This could be positive or negative emotion elicited from the speech. This is another very powerful form of persuasion when looking at convincing someone of something. And so it could be positive or negative, meaning it could give you positive emotions towards something that the speaker is advocating for, or negative emotion against someone or something that the speaker is advocating against. Again, when looking at politics, we can see this very clearly. When a political figure is campaigning for themselves, they will use phrases and terminology that will make you feel very positive towards them and their campaign and what they're doing and what they're advocating for. However, when talking about their opponent or an opposing ideology or an opposing party, you see a lot of negative words, negative images in the phrasing and the words they choose to go against or to combat the ideas that they're going up against. And the last one that we're going to talk about is ethos, which is credibility given to the speaker by the audience member. So this is an assumption of the character of the speaker, and the speaker can try to establish this in his speech. For example, again, with politics, just because it's super easy to see how this is used there. They will give themselves credibility or try to convince you of their credibility through things that they've accomplished, how long they've been in politics, et cetera, et cetera. So their accomplishments that they list out would say, this gives me credibility to do X, Y, and Z. So you should believe me on this subject. So that would be ethos. So there are 5 canons of rhetoric. So these are 5 ways to measure the quality of the speaker's ability and performance. So this is going to come more towards how skilled of a speaker and how convincing of a speaker that the presenter is. So there's invention, which is the construction of the argument itself and how well constructed and how well organized and put together it is. There's the arrangement of it, which would be the ordering of the material, so how they choose to set things up as far as the ordering of it. So how they can lead you to ideas through previous points, etc. There's the style, so the language that they choose to use. So depending on the audience they're trying to appeal to, right? If they're trying to appeal to a younger audience, then they might use more slang that had come in recent years. But if they're trying to appeal to a more academic, professional audience, then they wouldn't be using this kind of slang. And so the style of the speech could change. Delivery, so the technique of the presentation. So this could be This could be very forceful. This could be soft. It really depends on what they're trying to get across. So if you want to come across as really strong and really definite, and really powerful, then you would have that type of delivery, that type of presentation. But if you want to come off as easygoing and caring and easy to get along with and really approachable, then you would have that kind of delivery. And then the fifth canon, which wasn't originally added by Aristotle, but added by some of his predecessors, is memory, so knowledge of the ideas presented. And originally this wasn't included because it was assumed. So when these were originally written, memory was assumed as one of these canons. They would assume that you would have memory or knowledge of what you were presenting before you were presenting it. But some felt necessary to clarify that memory is a definite canon that you need when looking at these things as rhetoric. And today we can see why that might be important, having knowledge of the ideas presented, because there seems to be increasingly a lack of that due to social media and such. So the golden mean, this is going to be the balance that you find in your arguments. So Aristotle taught that moderation is best when presenting and trying to convince an audience of something. So the extremes of emotional appeal and logical appeal can lead to lies and secrecy or recklessness and brutal honesty. Richard Kraut explains that Aristotle referred to these things as akrasia and enkrasia. Now, I might have brutally mispronounced those, but akrasia is the word used for reason, and enkriasia is the word used for feeling. And so balancing these two is what Aristotle refers to as the golden mean. And so if you're going super hard and super extreme on the emotional side of things, then Aristotle taught that this could lead to lies and secrecy on trying to, again, elicit that emotion and trying to get that feeling out of them in order for them to become convinced of your argument. And then on the other side of things, when you go just super hardline for a reason and you give no room for any kind of emotion or any kind of feeling in it, then you could be very brutal, come off as very reckless, and come off as very cold-hearted, which again could damage your argument. So in ministry, rhetoric is used in many ways, right? And most obviously, we see the use of rhetoric in our sermons. So on a Sunday morning in church, obviously, if the pastor's getting up and presenting Scripture to us and showing us what Scripture is saying and how we ought to live our lives, then he's going to be using rhetoric to convince us of the truth of Scripture and the effect that it should have on us. And we can see in how all three, logos, ethnos, and panthos, are all used in a sermon, right? Logos used for reason on, okay, this is exactly what the Scripture is saying. Ethnos on the credibility given to him as the pastor, and panthos being the feeling that we ought to get, right? Eliciting either the goodness and greatness of the Lord and how he can really explain that in a way that makes you feel in awe of God, or speaking of the evil and corruption of sin that could make us feel convicted of our sin. So in sermons, you can see it very clearly demonstrated. In evangelism, in showing others why Scripture is trustworthy and virtuous, again, we would be using a mixture of these things to show people that Scripture is true and giving them the reasons and convincing them that these are good and these are true things that ought to be followed. And in missions, giving a defense for our faith and explaining and giving an explanation for our good deeds, right? And so in similar to evangelism, convincing others of the gospel, but with a unique twist on it of being approached on why we're doing what we're doing. Right? And so using rhetoric in these ways can be very, very good in convincing others the truth of the gospel and the truth of Scripture. So for our activity today, we're going to get into groups of 3 or 4, and we're going to take turns making a short speech on why you think that chocolate is the best flavor of ice cream. Now, whether you actually believe that chocolate is the best flavor or not is irrelevant, but get into groups of 3 or 4, and I want you to give us just a short speech on why you think that that's the best flavor, and make your argument appeal really heavily towards feeling or really heavily towards reason. And the purpose of this is going to be having an understanding of that golden mean, which Aristotle taught as very important. And so everyone else in the group will then decide whether your appeal has a heavier leaning on reason or a heavier leaning on feeling, and how this speech could be changed in order to fit into that golden mean. So go ahead and get into those groups, and then we'll recoup right after. All right. And these are our sources for today. I used Emily Zickel's Rhetorical Appeals for Logos, Panthos, and Ethnos. I used Richard Kraut's Aristotle's Ethics when looking at those words that I could hardly pronounce whenever we were studying Golden Mean. And I used Michael Drout's Away with Words, Writing, Rhetoric, and the Art of Persuasion when looking more into the history of rhetoric.